It was March 14th, 1987, and Tom Weston was 32 years old when he told his father he didn't want the tractor. They were standing in the machine shed on the family farm outside of Boone, Iowa, where 4 generations had worked the same 480 acres of black dirt. The tractor in question was a 1979 International Harvester 1086, red as the day it rolled off the line, paid for in full, maintained like a piece of family silver. Tom's father had bought it new with cash from 6 good corn years. It had 4,200 hours on it. The engine was sound. The transmission was tight. There was no reason in the world not to take it except the one Tom gave, which was that he wanted something bigger, something newer, something his own. His father didn't argue. He just nodded slowly, the way men do when they know the conversation is already over, and walked back to the house. Tom drove to the Case IH dealer in Ames the next morning. Tom had grown up on that farm the way most boys did in those years. He started on the equipment when he was tall enough to reach the pedals, learned to read the soil before he could read a book, understood that weather was both employer and enemy. His grandfather had bought the place in 1923 with money saved from working the railroads. His father had taken it over in 1964, the year Tom was born, and had farmed it carefully, never borrowing more than he had to, never planting more than the ground could give back. It was a philosophy built on caution, and it had worked. The farm had survived the bad years in the 70s when neighbors went under. It had survived the interest rates that climbed into the sky and stayed there. By 1987, the Weston farm was one of the few in the county that carried almost no debt. Tom's father had always said that a paid-for farm could weather any storm. Tom had heard it so many times he stopped listening. What Tom wanted was scale. He had read the magazines, he had been to the farm shows, he had talked to the agronomists and the seed dealers and the men who came through selling the future in glossy brochures. They all said the same thing: get bigger or get out. The small farms were dying. The only way to survive was to add ground, add equipment, add capacity. Tom looked at the 480 acres his family had always worked and saw a limitation. He looked at the International Harvester in the shed and saw the past. What he wanted was a Case IH 7120 Magnum. It was 145 horsepower. It had a turbo. It could pull a 12-bottom plow. It was the kind of machine that said you were serious, that you were thinking ahead, that you weren't going to be one of the ones who disappeared. The dealer had one on the lot, barely used, a 1986 model with 320 hours. The price was $68,000. Tom didn't have $68,000. What he had was equity in a farm with no debt and a banker who was more than willing to lend against it. His father said nothing when Tom came back with the papers. His mother set the table for dinner and didn't look up. His younger brother Carl, who was 26 and still working as hired help on the farm, asked Tom if he was sure. Tom said he was. He signed the loan on March 23, 1987. The payments were $1,140 a month for 7 years. Tom figured it would be easy. Corn was over $2 a bushel. Beans were solid. He had a plan to rent another 240 acres from a neighbor who was getting too old to farm it himself. The Case IH 7120 would let him work all of it faster, plant earlier, harvest quicker, turn more ground in less time. It made sense on paper. It made sense in his head. The only place it didn't make sense was in the look on his father's face the day the tractor was delivered. The first year went fine. Tom rented the additional ground. He planted 720 acres of corn and beans. The weather cooperated. The yields were good. He made his payments and had money left over. He told himself he'd been right. The second year was harder. It rained in May and kept raining. He got the crop in late. The beans didn't finish right. Corn prices dropped to $1.75. He made the payments, but barely. The third year, his father got sick. It was his heart. He went into the hospital in July and came out in August with instructions to take it easy, which for a man who had worked every day of his life since he was 12 meant sitting in a chair and watching someone else do it. Tom took over everything. He farmed the ground, managed the bills, made the decisions. Carl helped when he could, but Carl had gotten married and moved to a place 10 miles away. Tom's father sat in the house and didn't say much. By the end of that year, Tom was behind on 2 payments. The bank called in November. They weren't threatening, not yet, but they wanted to know the plan. Tom said the plan was to catch up in the spring. The loan officer, a man named Dennis, who Tom had known since high school, said that was fine, but they'd need to see it happen. Tom said it would. He planted in 1990 with money he borrowed against the next crop. Corn went to $2.20 a bushel in July, and Tom thought maybe he'd turned a corner. Then it dropped to $2.05 by September. Then his father died 3 days before Thanksgiving. They buried him on a cold Saturday, with the ground frozen hard and the wind coming in from the northwest. Tom stood at the grave and thought about the tractor his father had wanted him to take, the one still sitting in the shed with 5,100 hours on it now, still running perfectly, still paid for. He thought about the Case IH 7120 with its monthly payment and the way it sat in the same shed, like a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. The farm was his now. His mother signed it over without argument. Carl didn't want it. He was working construction and doing fine. Tom's wife Linda had always supported him, or at least she had never said she didn't. But after the funeral, she started asking questions about the debt. How much did they owe? How long would it take to pay off? What happened if they had another bad year? Tom told her not to worry. He told her farms always look bad on paper. He told her his father had worried too much, and that was why the farm had never grown. Linda didn't argue, but she stopped asking questions, and that felt worse somehow. In 1991, Tom borrowed more money to rent another 160 acres. He told himself it was about efficiency. The Case IH 7120 could handle it. The real reason was that he needed more income to cover what he owed. The payment on the tractor was still $340 a month, and he was 6 months behind. The bank restructured the loan. They added the missed payments to the principal and extended the term to 10 years. The new payment was $1,180 a month. It felt like relief at the time. What it actually was more years of obligation. Tom planted that spring with a kind of determination that felt like anger. He worked longer days. He pushed the equipment harder. He didn't take a day off from April to October. The yields were average. The prices were average. He made 9 of the 12 payments. By 1993, Tom owed $54,000 on a tractor he'd bought for $68,000 7 years earlier. The Case IH 7120 had 3,800 hours on it. It needed new rear tires. It needed a clutch. The repairs cost $4,200, and Tom put them on a credit card because the bank wouldn't extend him any more operating credit until he caught up on the tractor loan. He caught up by selling 120 acres of the farm to a neighbor who wanted the ground for his own son. Tom's mother cried when she found out. She said his father would never have sold land. Tom said his father never had to deal with what he was dealing with. The words came out harder than he meant them, and his mother didn't speak to him for 2 months. He used the money from the sale to pay off the tractor loan completely. For the first time in 6 years, he didn't owe anything on the Case IH 7120. It should have felt like freedom. Instead, it felt like he'd traded his future for his present. The mid-90s were flat. Corn stayed between 2 and 250. Beans were steady. Tom worked 600 acres now, the remaining family ground plus rented land. The Case IH 7120 was the right size for it, which meant the decision hadn't been completely wrong, but it also meant he was locked into a scale that required him to keep renting, keep borrowing for seed and chemicals, keep running just to stay even. In 1996, his daughter Emily was born. In 1998, his son Jack came along. Linda stopped working at the seed company to stay home with them. The lost income mattered more than Tom wanted to admit. He started carrying a balance on the operating loan that never quite went to zero. The bank said it was normal. Most farmers did it. Tom remembered his father saying that normal didn't mean safe. In 2001, corn dropped to $1.90. Tom planted anyway because what else was he going to do? The crop was good, but the price stayed low. He lost money that year for the first time in his life, actual red ink on the year-end statement. The operating loan went from $22,000 to $38,000. In 2002, it went to $51,000. The bank wanted collateral. Tom signed over the remaining 360 acres as security. His mother had moved to town by then, into a small house near the church. She came out for Sunday dinners and didn't ask about the farm anymore. Carl had moved to Des Moines and worked for a construction firm. He came back at Christmas and asked Tom how it was going. Tom said fine. Carl didn't believe him, but he didn't push. The Case IH 7120 turned over 7,000 hours in 2004. Tom had owned it for 17 years. It had outlasted the loan, outlasted his father, outlasted the version of himself that had believed scale was the answer. The tractor still ran well. He maintained it carefully because he couldn't afford not to. But it had also become a monument to a choice he couldn't undo. Every time he climbed into the cab, he thought about the international harvester his father had offered him, the one he could have taken for free, the one that would have let him farm without debt, without the constant pressure to add ground and chase income. He had sold that tractor in 1995 to a man who restored old equipment. He got $4,500 for it. The man told him it was a shame to let it go, that they didn't make them like that anymore. Tom had nodded and taken the check and used the money to fix a grain bin. In 2008, something strange happened. Corn went to $4 a bushel, then $5, then $6. Tom planted every acre he could rent, and the crop came in strong, and for the first time in a decade, he made actual money. He paid the operating loan down to $12,000. He bought Linda a new kitchen table. He took the kids to the state fair. It felt like maybe the hard years had been worth it, like maybe the gamble had finally paid off. Then 2009 came and corn dropped back to $3, and the operating loan climbed back to $34,000, and the brief window of possibility closed as fast as it had opened. Tom realized something that year that he'd been avoiding for a long time. He wasn't farming to get ahead. He was farming to service the decisions he'd made 20 years earlier. His son Jack, who was 11, started asking about the farm. He wanted to know if they'd always done it this way. Tom tried to explain the history, the choices, the way things had changed. Jack asked why they didn't just farm less ground and owe less money. Tom didn't have a good answer. Linda, sitting at the kitchen table with them, looked at Tom in a way that said she'd been wondering the same thing. That night, Tom went out to the machine shed and sat in the Case IH 7120 in the dark. The cab smelled like diesel and wear and time. He thought about his father, standing in this same shed in 1987, telling him the International Harvester was his if he wanted it. He thought about how simple that offer had been and how completely he'd rejected it. He wondered what the farm would look like now if he'd said yes. By 2012, Tom was 57 years old. The Case IH 7120 had 9,200 hours. The operating loan was $48,000. Corn prices had been good enough to survive, but not good enough to get out from under the weight. Tom started having conversations with Linda about selling. Not the equipment, the farm. She asked him where they would go. He said he didn't know, but they couldn't keep doing this. She asked if he'd talked to Jack about it. Jack was 14 now and had been working on the farm every summer. He loved it the way Tom had loved it at that age. Tom said he hadn't talked to him yet. Linda said he should. Tom said he would. He didn't. In 2013, the transmission on the Case IH 7120 finally went. It had lasted 26 years and over 9,000 hours, and it didn't owe Tom anything, but the repair cost was $11,000. Tom didn't have $11,000. The bank wouldn't loan it to him because he was already at his limit. He called the dealer and asked about trade-in value. They offered him $18,000. He'd paid $68,000 for it in 1987. He'd put $30,000 into repairs and maintenance over the years. He'd made payments on it for 7 years and then paid it off by selling land. The total cost of owning the tractor when he added it all up was somewhere over $110,000. He could sell it now for $18,000 and use the money to fix something else that would break eventually. Or he could fix it for $11,000 and keep going. He fixed it. He borrowed the money from his brother Carl, who didn't ask questions but made Tom promise to pay him back within 2 years. Tom paid Carl back in 2015 by selling timber off the back 40 acres. It was land his grandfather had left in trees deliberately, a windbreak and a reserve, something to hold for the future. Tom cut it and sold it and sent Carl a check. His mother died that same year. She was 89. At the funeral, people talked about how she'd lived through the Depression and the war and had raised her family on a farm that never quit. Tom wondered what she would think of the farm now, 360 acres of what had been 480, mortgaged and leveraged and held together by loans and luck. He didn't cry at the funeral. He cried 2 weeks later when he was greasing the Case IH 7120 and found a piece of baling wire his father had used to fix a hydraulic line back in the 90s. It was still there, still holding. In 2016, Tom started hearing about neighbors who were getting out. Not retiring, getting out. One man walked away and let the bank take the farm. Another sold at auction and moved to town and took a job at the co-op. A third one hung on by renting out his ground and working full-time at the ethanol plant. Tom asked them quietly what it felt like to stop. They all said some version of the same thing. It felt like relief, but Tom couldn't imagine it. He'd fought too long, owed too much, invested too much of himself to just walk away. The Case IH 7120 was still running. He was still making the operating loan payments. Jack had graduated high school and was talking about going to Iowa State for ag business. If Tom quit now, what would it all have been for? By 2017, 30 years had passed since Tom downed his father's tractor and bought the Case IH 7120. The farm was still there. Tom was still farming it. But the cost of that continuity was measurable now in ways it hadn't been in 1987. He had sold 120 acres to pay off the tractor. He had mortgaged the rest to cover operating costs. He had borrowed from his brother and cut the timber and worked himself into a state of exhaustion that felt permanent. The operating loan was $55,000. Corn was $3.20. The math didn't work anymore, and everyone knew it. The bank called in October and said they needed to restructure again. Tom said he'd come in. He didn't go. He sat at the kitchen table with the loan papers and the production records and tried to see a way through. Linda sat across from him. She was 54. She looked tired. She said they could sell. Tom said he knew. She said Jack didn't have to farm. Tom said he knew that too. She asked what he wanted. Tom said he didn't know anymore. The thing Tom couldn't stop thinking about was the math of it. If he had taken his father's tractor in 1987, he would have farmed the same 480 acres with no debt. He wouldn't have bought the additional ground. He wouldn't have needed the operating loans. He would have made less money in the good years, but he wouldn't have lost as much in the bad ones. The International Harvester would have lasted 15 years, maybe 20. When it finally wore out, he could have bought a used tractor with cash, something reasonable, something that fit the ground he had. He could have farmed smaller and steadier and safer. His father had offered him exactly that, and Tom had said no because he thought his father didn't understand the future. 30 years later, Tom understood that his father had understood perfectly. He had understood that debt was a kind of weather you couldn't predict and couldn't control. He had understood that equipment was a tool, not a strategy. He had understood that a farm measured in generations couldn't afford to be measured in payments. Tom drove out to the land he'd sold in 1993. It was still being farmed, different equipment now, different crops in some years. The neighbor who bought it had given it to his son, who was doing well, who had expanded carefully, who farmed with a mix of owned and rented ground, but never more than he could handle. Tom stood at the fence line and looked at dirt that had belonged to his family for 70 years and didn't belong to them anymore. He thought about his grandfather buying this place in 1923 with railroad money. He thought about his father taking it over in 1964 and farming it until 1990 without ever selling an acre. He thought about himself at 32, so sure that he knew better, so convinced that the old ways were dying and the only choice was to grow. He had been wrong. Not about everything. The Case IH 7120 had been a good tractor. It had done the work, but the cost of owning it, the debt it required, the decisions it forced, had compounded over 30 years into something Tom couldn't undo. In November 2017, Tom sat down with Jack. Jack was 19. He was home from college for Thanksgiving. He asked Tom if he should switch his major to ag business or just come home and start farming. Tom asked him what he wanted. Jack said he wanted to farm. Tom asked him why. Jack said because it was what they did. Tom told him no. He told him farming was something you did if you loved it more than you loved security, more than you loved sleep, more than you loved the idea of a life that made sense on paper. He told him it was something you did if you were willing to owe and work and lose and keep going anyway. He told him it wasn't a legacy you inherited. It was a choice you made every single day. Jack asked if Tom regretted it. Tom said he didn't know yet. He said, "Ask me in another 30 years. Tom met with the bank in December. They restructured the operating loan again. They extended the term. They raised the interest rate slightly. They made it possible for Tom to keep going for another year, maybe two. The loan officer, a younger man now, not Dennis anymore, asked Tom what his long-term plan was. Tom said he was working on it. The truth was, he didn't have one. The truth was he'd been working on it for 30 years, and the plan had always been the same. Farm harder, add more ground, make it work. It had worked just enough to keep him going, and not enough to ever get ahead. He thought about the neighbors who had gotten out, the ones who had walked away or sold or just stopped. He wondered if they slept better at night. He wondered if they ever missed it. The Case IH 7120 sat in the machine shed, next to the newer equipment Tom had acquired over the years. A planter, a cultivator, a grain cart. The tractor had 11,400 hours on it now. The paint was faded, the cab was worn, the engine still ran strong. Tom figured it had another few thousand hours left if he kept taking care of it. He would keep taking care of it. Not because it made financial sense, not because it was the smart decision, but because 30 years ago he had chosen it over his father's tractor, and everything that followed had been a consequence of that choice. The debt, the land sales, the pressure, the weight, all of it traced back to March 1987, and a 32-year-old man who thought he knew what the future required. Tom couldn't undo it. He couldn't go back. All he could do was keep going forward with the tractor that had defined his life and the debt that had shaped it. On a cold morning in January 2018, Tom walked out to the machine shed before sunrise. He climbed into the Case IH 7120 and started it up. The engine turned over on the first try. The cab was freezing. He let it warm up and sat there in the dark, the instrument panel glowing faintly, the smell of diesel and cold air and 30 years of work. He thought about his father, gone now for 27 years, buried in the cemetery on the edge of town. He thought about the International Harvester, sold and gone, and probably still running somewhere for someone who appreciated it. He thought about the choice he'd made, and whether he would make it again if he could go back. He didn't know. What he knew was that the choice had made him. It had shaped every year since. It had cost him land and money and peace of mind. It had also kept the farm going, kept him farming, kept the work alive. Whether that was worth it, he couldn't say. The tractor idled steady. The sun was starting to come up. Tom put it in gear and drove out to check the fields. There was work to do. There was always work to do.